Hi, welcome back. I think we're going to get started with the penultimate session of this wonderful symposium. So this is the last of multi panels called Curators, Reskilling and Rethinking. And I think that the curators and critic who are going to speak to us are going to deal with many of the practical issues within institutions that we've been talking about all weekend. I'll just introduce quickly the speakers. The first speaker is Darcy Alexander, who's the chief curator at the Walker Art Center, where she supervises curatorial programs for visual arts, performing arts, film, video, design, and the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. Recent exhibitions she's organized include the Spectacular Vernacular in 2011, Event Horizon in 2009, Benches and Binoculars also in 2009, and Darcy's also spearheading the acquisition of the Merce Cunningham archive there as well. The second speaker is Ferran Barenblit, the director of the Centro de Arte dos de Mayo in Madrid, and he was born in Buenos Aires. Ferran will be followed by Liz Kotz, and Liz teaches modern and contemporary art history at UC Riverside and writes for Art Forum and other publications. She's the author of Words to be Looked At, Language in 1960s Art, which is a really wonderful study. She's currently developing 2 book projects, a collection of interviews with LA-based artists, and an examination of the 1963 publication, An Anthology of Chance Operations. After their talk, a response will be by Sabine Breitwieser, who needs no introduction to us. Her opening talk really shaped this whole weekend, and Sabine is the chief curator of media and performance at the Museum of Modern Art. So let's welcome Darcy Alexander.
Thank you. The panel, Curators, Reskilling, Critics, Rethinking. There's a lot in that, as there is in just the concept of how we address time and time-based media. It's in many ways a very challenging and broad category, but one that we think about a lot internally at art institutions such as the Walker Art Center where I work, but also just more generally within art schools and art history departments. I think to the question of reskilling, rethinking, the past few days has really illustrated the tremendous effort on the part of curators and artists and scholars around this subject of the time-based, be it in the form of events or performances, moving images, or even conferences like this one. All very, very different manifestations of time, but still really fascinating ones. Over the course of the past couple of days, we've talked about questions around archiving and documentation, which continue to surface. We've discussed how ownership is procured and value ascribed to time-based works, I think raising some pretty interesting points of contention and discourse. We've also learned about growing fields of scholarship such as sound, and also gained some familiarity with post-war art and artists who have been generally fairly underrepresented in the discourses of art history and museums. I think, though, while we have been talking very specifically about these matters and these artists, there's maybe even a bigger context to cast here. And I speak as someone who has been in the museum profession for about 15 years now, and I feel like I've seen a tremendous shift in the numbers of programs and resources being directed to this phenomenon of time-based art. I know reenactment is something that's been happening since the 60s. But still, I feel that we're seeing more in-gallery performances, including a lot more of these reenactments, more festivals and biennales, more participatory encounters designed to animate visitor experience, and more artists working in these arenas than ever before. Now, why this has happened and why now, I think, is a really interesting question. I know it's impacted and is continuing to impact what I do as a curator and what my colleagues do. But I just want to hold that question for a moment in the air, because I do think that there is a long trajectory of many of these histories to be discussed, but I also feel that we're at a moment of change. And so I want to put that out there and then maybe return to it at the end. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the programs that have happened at the Walker, more as a case study and not specifically to try to do any kind of institutional narrative for you. I wanted to start, though, with this beautiful piece by Felix Gonzalez Torres, and I'm going to turn it around here so that I can look at it while you're looking at it. I was wondering, I was worried I was going last, and I thought someone is going to put up that Felix Gonzalez Torres slide. And I'm so thankful, participants, that you have not used this image, because I think it's really one of the best, most beautiful, actually, and I use that word with some degree of trepidation, but works of its era. And I'm sure many of you know the story that it's called Perfect Lovers, and it was made shortly after Felix Gonzalez Torres' lover died of AIDS in '91. And you know, and there are these two clocks, of course, battery operated, and over time, originally synchronized to be perfectly in match with one another, though of course over time, as the batteries run out, the numbers and the hands fall out of sync, just as we do in life. This piece is about technology, but it's also about people. And I think a lot about people as a curator. I think about artists, but I also think of all of the people that I work with on a daily basis. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I think that where I'm coming from to this conversation about time is very much as a professional who's interested in this subject. I started my career as a photography curator, the quintessential time-based medium, but I'm also a manager, and I spend a lot of time thinking about how people, curators in particular, are exploring this growing territory of performance, participation, and event-based practice, often with no explicit training in these areas, which I think is an important thing also to return to. Our fields have become more expansive, more horizontal, if you will. Our curators are, I think, being expected to know more about a lot of stuff rather than a lot about something very particular, which is maybe a shift that's happening in the way training is occurring on the graduate level, but sort of to be continued on that issue. I wanted to just address a little bit about how an institution like the Walker encapsulates and includes various forms of time-based art, some in a very formal way and some in a very informal way. And so I'm going to give a couple of examples of both, because I think they have to do with how we're doing our jobs a little bit differently, and maybe that'll kind of come out as the conversation continues. In the more sort of traditional vein, we have a very untraditional performing arts program that regularly hosts approximately, between 25 and 30 performances a year. They can be commissions, they can be residencies, and even within the performing arts department, it's a very multidisciplinary department. In other words, it's jazz, it's spoken word, it's dance, it's avant rock. So even within the discipline structure that is still very much intact at a place like the Walker, which has a division for design and media, film and video, visual arts, which is the gallery and acquisition arm, and performing arts, all of those sectors have their variant components of artistic practice within them. The Walker has always made an effort to be engaging artists across disciplines. So for the past 20 years, and even further back, Cunningham performed through a Walker program in 1963, so that our connection to performing arts has a long legacy. But we've always made an effort to give opportunities to artists in a way that we like to describe as sort of, you can come in one door, i.e. the performing arts program, and you can go out of another if you want. Because that's what we want to provide you artists as an institution, is the opportunity to really expand your practices, to push the limits of what you think you can do. Because actually, as a center, as a true arts center, we have these resources that for artists who really want to push out of their practice zones and out of their own sort of boxes, if you will, we have the capability to help them do that. And because we've often been a catalyst for artists at critical times in their careers, we have long relationships with them. So, you know, early performances with Merce Cunningham, early performances with Trisha Brown, and then those artists sort of come back, and we continue to grow those relationships over time. Also, in the mix of all this, we have a lively exhibition program, which of course is related to the performing arts program and has been for some time. And this is I'm showing a slide of a show that was presented in 1998 called Art Performs Life. And it was an early attempt to start to begin to address how you tell the history of one medium basically through another one. In this case, it was Meredith Monk, Bill T. Jones, and Merce Cunningham were the subjects. Again, artists with whom we'd had a long relationship, co-curated between the departments of the performing and the visual arts. And you can see that from the installation shot that we were still kind of figuring out, you know, how do you both, again, kind of create a narrative in a sort of quasi-permanent form, i.e. the gallery space, without completely calcifying the liveness of the experience? And I know we've all touched upon, you know, various questions of documentation, but into that I would throw, you know, visitor participation, live performance in the galleries. Like, what are the ways that as curators we can bring into the present tense both the history of these artists and make the experience one that feels rich and present. We have a unique opportunity to do that now because we recently acquired the Merce Cunningham Dance Archive. And that archive came in about a year ago. Actually, it's still backing up in trucks to our loading dock. This Merce Cunningham saved absolutely everything. But we're very fortunate to have had the opportunity to acquire works that came out of his very important collaborations with artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, Ernesto Neto, Deb Bradshaw. He was an artist who really understood, I think through Cage's encouragement, the great role that visual arts can play on the stage. And we have started to do some, what I'm calling kind of experimental or research exhibitions to start to get into the questions of how to present this material, again, without over-canonizing it, without over-dictating kind of a master narrative, if you will, or again, sort of petrifying these objects. I mean, you want to talk about patina? These things are covered in sweat stains. They're just a conservation nightmare. I mean, these are objects that lived on the physical body of people, and there's nothing romantic about that. It's very physical work, and the traces of human action is emblazoned on all of them. The reason that I wanted to sort of bring in Cunningham and Rauschenberg in particular is because they had a really, really interesting collaboration. And what we try to do, and what I try to do, I'm very conscious of as a curator, is how can I learn from artists in the way that they work with each other? Now, Cunningham and Rauschenberg worked together, and I have to say Cage too, because he was such a critical part of the relationship, very much from like 1954 to 1964. These were absolutely critical years for Robert Rauschenberg and his development. When he started doing the Combine paintings, he was doing the red paintings as well. His work was just spreading across the globe, in large part because he was traveling with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, so he was taking his work out into the world as he was traveling as stage and set designer for Cunningham. And the reason that the relationship worked so well is because Cunningham gave the artists with whom he collaborated total artistic freedom. Right? They weren't really collaborations. They were more like, you go off and do what you need to do over there, and I'm going to go off and do what I need to do over here, and all of us will come together at the moment of the performance. And it gave artists just this incredible sense of empowerment. I mean, he really believed that that all of the art was sort of on the same playing field as the choreography. Now, things broke down a little bit in 1964 when Rauschenberg himself got on the stage with Cunningham and started to perform the sets live, which was a little bit too much. It was interesting because they both had very different takes on the notion of chance effect. Cunningham was very rigorous and very orderly. Rauschenberg was much more spontaneous and improvisational, and ultimately sort of those different approaches led to the sort of the demise, if you will, of their relationship. But it's been really interesting to understand, like, what makes a collaboration between people tick. And that's something that I ask both as a curator and I ask it as a manager. So I try to, like, move back and forth between the world of art and the world of people in my daily life. And this is just another installation shot of the Rauschenberg-Cunningham show. So you can actually see really interesting parallels that were happening between. So there's the set design on the right, and there's a painting on the left. So thinking about the way that screens and forms break down into sculptural elements, they were both collapsible, same palette more or less. I mean, the story to be told about the relationship of the studio to the stage is a really interesting one that's going to come out in this project, I hope. The thing that I just mentioned in Cunningham and Cage is that they were constantly pushing each other's threshold of creativity and tolerance, and I guess that was one of the takeaways for me studying that relationship, because I feel like one of the things that we need to do as curators is push the level of creativity and tolerance. And that leads me to a project that we did with an artist named Haegyu Yang in 2009, who basically she's a Korean artist who's now living in Berlin, and there's really no easy way to describe her practice. She moves very readily between different media and platforms, and she wanted to come to the Walker not to make a big grandiose statement, but to really kind of experiment with some ideas that she's been exploring over the course of her career. And the way that she described what she wanted out of her relationship with the institution is as follows. I'm interested in how you, audience and institution, can accommodate me, artist. As we investigate the possibility of our coexistence, we explore the possibility of reaching a consensus of non-coexistence. And she'll love that. But even within her practice itself, she is challenging us and proceeded to really challenge us within our sort of discipline areas of expertise, as well as challenging our ideas about contemporary art practice. The piece that she created was multi-faceted, and not a single piece, actually. There was no sort of center, in a way, to the project. She made a gallery installation, which I'm showing you a slide of now, for this show called Integrity of the Insider. And I wanted to talk and even expose some of you that may not know Haegyu's work, who may be from the dance world or the theater world, because I think she's paying a great deal of attention to elements of the stage and the construction of her spaces. Very bright stage lights and fans create this kind of feeling of this complete environment that she's making manifest. And it's also, there are several kind of participatory elements within the installation itself, such as a drum set that people can come and play. Additionally, she did a number of seminars with some of our staff, bringing in a lot of experts from outside of the field. And she staged a performance that was based on a piece by Marguerite Duras, and actually it wound up being performed by Jade of My Barbarians, which I just learned last night. But really, her whole premise was to force us out of our disciplines. And it was really hard. You know, she was constantly asking curators to act as producers, as talent scouts, as writers, as conduits, as travel agents. I mean, it was just this amazing shift that I feel is happening with a lot of artists coming out of school, where actually the structures that we have within these clearly define institutional hierarchies or divisions no longer can nimbly and flexibly respond to the different ways that art making is happening. There are people that are working very much in these traditional fields that operate within the gallery system or operate within the theater, but then there's this whole generation of people that just like don't even really care like exactly how they're interested in the space in between those fields, which I won't meant to talk about this piece, but I will go to this slide because you haven't seen this one. It sort of describes in images how we live with artists, how they become part of our ecosystem, and how we really look to artists to motivate and direct us and challenge us around our kind of normative patterns of behavior. So I just got the 5-minute sign about 5 minutes ago. So I'm gonna try to wrap this up by saying, you know, these groups are being formed now. These young groups of artists and also young groups of curators who are working very differently than basically my generation, and in a much more interdisciplinary, fluid fashion. And yet they're being, I think, pressured increasingly to really be able to work very nimbly across a multitude of different platforms. And I just would kind of throw this question out as I'm concluding. You know, how disciplinary specializations will ebb and flow as a result of these shifts, be they in time-based practice or other media, remains a lingering yet critical question as we make our way through what I continue to believe is a dramatic shift in how museums think about themselves and their relationship to audiences. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. First of all, thanks so much, Shannon, Sarah, Laura, Michelle, for bringing me here. Thanks so much, Matthias, my dear friend Matthias, because he was the invisible, or more or less invisible, matchmaker here for me being today with you. In fact, it's a privilege to be among the last to talk because there have been so many things said already that, in fact, I reshaped what I was going to say. In a way, I will be responding some of the questions, some of the issues right here. I tend to be faithful to directions in this kind of events, so I took good note of what Shannon requested originally some months ago, and we'll talk about what happens with time arrives to the exhibition. I know that here we have been mostly debated what happens with the performance, the time-based work arrives to the museum, but in my case I would like to talk about what happens with time when it's part of the exhibition itself. And I would introduce this concept of the expanded event as a form of institutional critique. That's the next step. As a forward, I would like to show you this project that we did recently. In fact, we installed it only some weeks ago by a German artist, Gregor Schneider. You may know of his installation in the 2001 Venice Biennial. He got the Golden Lion for this installation. And in fact, this is not an expanded event, but it brought time and the experience of time to the audience. The installation was a fairly complex system of pipes that the public had to walk inside, arriving to different of the spaces that form his original house. I mean, his work is so complex that I couldn't explain it here. But basically, the question is that one of the many things that they experienced was time, and especially losing the control of time. The audience was abducted during the minutes that they were inside the installation. Most people lost the sense of space and time, and one of the things that they experience is what happens when you are taken and when you vanish as a person inside the work, because it was extremely, this image shows some light. There was almost no light in most of the installations, so you had to work in absolute darkness. Okay, but going back, that was only a forward. Going back to the theme of my presentation, I want to talk about the expanded event, and I will start by the conclusions. The conclusion is that a number of artists in the last I would say 15 years, just to follow what has been recently said. I had my original note was some decades. Are exercising a type of institutional critique by including time in the exhibitions, especially when they are commissioned new works. Again, it's not about the time that is in the work itself, but in the exhibition. This is how this thought starts. And this is also a response to what was discussed during Sabine's presentation. And this is something that I've been thinking for a long time, that the history of art in the 20th century could be described as an attempt to create the work of art that it's impossible to exhibit and or to collect. You don't need the list, but know that that happened, now we know, since the 20s. But the history of curatorial work is, or could be described as the opposite, as the attempt to exhibit and to collect the work that has been done or having created, trying to defy that. Precisely, the expanded event lies on that point. And to explain this, I will use this project that I curated 7 years ago, 2005, with, and I was working at that moment in Barcelona in a place called Centro de Arte Santa Monica, now disappeared, and with local artist, Martí and Son, whose work, you have the title here, Fitzcarraldo, 55 days working in the construction of a Stella 54 yacht, was exactly that. During 55 days, in front of the public, he worked in the construction of a sailing yacht. He's really a skilled artist in terms of manual work. He's the kind of artist that other artists will call to ask for some help when they don't know how to do things. So he's really good. Well, this is some days that in the dairy that nothing happens because he doesn't get any supplies. And then he gets a bit desperate. And finally, well, the pieces arrive, he starts working, he's very good, he works very fast. He did almost alone. And if you think why he did a ship, it's because the biggest object that you can take outside of a building. Of course, a house is bigger, but you will never build a house inside the house. But a yacht and other things. The museum was close to the sea, so in fact originally it was used for that. So there were many other things in the project. So he did very well. Building upside down now. I mean, more or less it looked like this. He even had some time to do part of the interior, but the yacht was exactly 3 inches wider than the widest door. So next day, after the show was over, and that was not done in front of the public, the work had to be destroyed and dismantled in only some 2 hours. So the expanded event is something that does not exist for itself, but something that happens when the work of art changes during the time of the work remains on view in an exhibition. That's very important. And again, I will explain some other cases. Another, again, with the same artist, Martí and Son. He was invited to Site Santa Fe for the 2008 edition. And he did something similar. He worked in the construction of a flower factory. As you see, well, I haven't said that, but in his work, there are many metaphoric relationships with cinema. If Fitzcarraldo obviously makes a reference to Werner Herzog's film, An Impossible Dream of taking a ship on top of a mountain to go to the other side. But on this case, as it was the first international biennial, he was invited. He thought that he got the golden ticket. So again, it was like the case of the other factory. So again, he did very well. In this case, he didn't destroy the work. I think it's still in the same place. But the key here is that it's in the middle of nowhere. So mostly nobody saw the work. Only, I mean, you know of it, but it was in the middle of, Santa Fe is not very populated, so it was in the middle of the desert, and it disappeared after. There was another. Okay. So some of the ideas regarding the expanded event, it followed the logic of the institutional critique by posing questions to the assumed normalities that the institution of art has. Thus, it uses its own ephemerality to discuss symbolic and economic power in the art world. So that, I think that is very important. As a way of posing questions, as a way of discussing how economy, obviously in these two cases he produced and he used money, in Spain public money, in America maybe some donor that gave the money, some sponsor that gave the money to build this, not to create an object that could be later introduced in the art market, but to create an object that insisted in the experience at that time, and that pose a question to all of the works, the work of the role of the audience, the role of the museum, the role of the curator, and the role of the market. A similar case that I kept finding, I have to say also that I have never requested to an artist, please, I want you to do this, I want to work in this framework of, but it's something that you discover that you and working, and for some reason this happened. Another artist, from also a local artist in Barcelona, proposed a fountain that was linked to the toilets. The work was called Join Us. So in this case, the presence of the artist was not requested, but the audience could decide if they wanted to join or not. The first day the water was clean, the last day it was far from clean, even when nobody noticed, I have to say. It was, and maybe the most exaggerated example of that was Tere Recarens, a Berlin-based artist that made this work in 2004. She locked these two containers, maritime container, for 10 years. So now it's only 2 years away. I mean, they will be open. We only know that inside one, something will get better, and inside the other, the things will get worse. That is quite linked to her work in a way, because I mean, she's always about ups and downs, and so. But we'll see. Only 2 more years. Again, then Netko Solakov. In this case, is much more metaphoric. Even when he did present it, maybe some of you saw this work in the Venice Biennale, also I think in the same year, 2001. Yeah, it was a very good biennial. That he, as an artist, he presented a painting. I mean, what more artistic than a painting? But in this case, he expanded the painting during the 6 months that the show lasted, with these two painters painting black and white, and they stayed for exactly 6 months painting black and white, one layer after the other. So one was on that side, the other was on that side, and in this direction. But when we worked together, of course, I was not involved in this project. He also proposed me something quite linked to institutional critique, and discussing the symbolic layers of the relationship between the curator and the artist. And so, who's the boss? The project was rather complex, so I will try to be brief. This was the result. The result was a competition between the artist and the curator, myself. Because what happened is that, well, he came for a research in the city, and then he proposed me a project that I really liked, that it was involved working with that famous soccer player. But then only 4 weeks before opening the show, he changed his mind. That was hard. Yeah, and so we exchanged a number of emails, say, okay, each one keeping his own opinion. No? I wanted him to do my project. At that point, it was mine. And he wanted to do his project. No? And at some point, he called me, not emails anymore, he called me and told me, we have to talk. Maybe you have heard that in your life once. Referred to another, institution. Again, it's the critic of the institution of marriage. There are not so many differences between both, no? I'm completely serious. And so eventually the competition was finally the project. Obviously, I won this. He won this. He's exactly twice as my body mass, so he won this other. And but again, it was bringing. It was a very metaphoric expanded event because it brought the before to the meantime, to the show. So during the show, you could see what happened before the show and included this kind of difficult relationship that I'm sure all my fellow curators, colleagues here have experienced that, I mean, this has, because, and one thing of that institutional critique does is discuss symbolic power. Mm-hmm. Again, another sample, more recent in my life, we're working with Fredo Preto, Cuban artist. He proposed, let me see if it works. Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay, never mind. This is the still image. The show was entitled Tied to the Table's Leg. And the original idea was exactly having this piece during the whole duration of the show. That's why I envision it as an expanded event. And having the helicopter, it's a real one, it's not a model, even when in this image it may be a bit tricky, but it's a real helicopter tied to the table. And he insisted that this was not a performance. If we could do it only for 1 hour, it's because pilots make a lot of money, and we couldn't afford to have the helicopter every day being there for the 9 weeks that the show lasted. But it was a kind of event that would have happened during the whole exhibition. All the exhibition and the work with him, and I don't know if you are familiar with his work, also has this kind of ephemerality and time-based relationships with this. For example, this is inside the exhibition space. And this work is called Holy Water, and that's exactly what it is. It's a pond of holy water that obviously had to be replaced every day because it evaporates. And I think that I only have 2 more minutes, so I will be very quick. And now we'll talk about the 2 projects that we're showing right now in Centro de Arte de Mayo in Madrid. Precisely, and without knowing it, that I was going to be here today, they include this relationship with time and this notion of expanded event. The first is this very young Colombian artist, Ivan Argote, that he deals with a very complex themes, basically linked to a kind of a nostalgic biographical situation. But when coming to the museum, it's interesting that this is the space where he's exhibiting, but basically works in video. But he decided to turn the very last part of the space into a space that he will give to one person every day to celebrate his or her birthday. And at the beginning, I didn't understand very well what was the work about, but then I discovered not only this amount of nostalgia as but also because, well, I mean, a birthday is like one. It's so metaphorically so linked to a work of art. No, you think that you are very special that day, but you know that, I mean, everybody, I mean, has a birthday every day. No, it happens the same with the work of art. No, it seems like a different object, but it's one more in a way. And but it's interesting how he generated again another expanded event. No, and well, this is and it's incredible how it works. Emotionally, it's quite loaded. It's very interesting, especially because it's very interesting how it's a reflection of the diversity of our own audience. Few insiders, I mean, there are a couple of artists here, but most just people who understood the idea, and they are all very happy. That's very interesting. They are requested to take Polaroid images. That's maybe the most artistification of the part. And finally, the other show that we have at this moment, the Dutch artist Arnold Meek, that is extremely interesting. He had a solo show, I think, at the MoMA 2 years ago. In fact, we're showing the piece that MoMA commissioned. And it's, again, very complex artist. I mean, I'm not trying to reduce him to what I'm going to explain. But, again, he proposed us, to my surprise, again, another expanded event. He requested us to select some performers, amateur people, 2 groups, one of retired people, the other of teenagers. The retired people are quite old, the teenagers are really young. and to act as an active public during the length of the show. So exactly, in fact, today we had one of the performances this afternoon in Spain, and again it's very interesting because we cannot take photos of what's going on because the key is that you will never know if the performance is going on or not. You are told there will be a performance of active public, and what the public does, these are shots of them. These are some of the performers. They mimetically repeat in a way repeat what is happening in the screens with the images. You know that he mostly works in video, even when, as you've seen, he's also quite focused also in installation. And again, that's very interesting because this elapsing of the time of while the event goes on, it brings new layers. That goes back to the conclusion, I will finish with this, that it's a way of posing questions to the institution of art itself and for the roles of each one of us, and to how the power functions, and what's the role of, in this case, especially what's the role of the audience. Thanks.
I'm starting here with an image of a film installation. It's a work called Passage that's a collaboration between two artists, Tashi Wada, who's a young composer, and Madison Brookshire, who's a filmmaker. And it's actually from its presentation in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago at this performance space called The Wolf that is this weird nonprofit sort of music space that is also basically where two guys live. So I live in this rather other world that tends to be the more, shall we say, informal and self-organized sector. Okay, what I want to talk about today, or sort of use as a focus, I want to think about two moments, and I'm going to start with historical stuff and then I'll come back to this at the end. The first moment I want to talk about is what is for me this still really foundational moment of sort of 1960 to 1961, and particularly the thing I want to talk about is the Chamber Street series, the series of concerts that Lamont Young organized at Yoko Ono's loft. It's a series of events that I hope people are somewhat familiar with that is to me really emblematic of this crucial moment that is the sort of proto-conceptual, proto-minimal, proto-fluxus, kind of proto-everything moment that I think crystallizes a whole bunch of really important investigations. And then the second moment that I want to think about is sort of what's going on today, particularly because I'm sort of around a circle of people, sort of young visual artists, but also musicians and filmmakers who in the last several years have been doing a lot of work. And it really interests me that among many people I know that there's this really intense re-engagement with this sort of much earlier legacy. And I'm interested in what that's about, what the relation is, what the larger stakes are, why a certain type of work is, again, compelling, at least for some people. Oops. Oh, it's okay. That's one. So just to lay out a few things about the Chamber Street series, it's a nightmare for art historians, partly because there are virtually no images. And so what we have in terms of documentation is mostly typed programs. And as you can see here, this is the first one. It's for a concert by Terry Jennings, who was a young minimalist composer based in LA. He was a close friend of Lamont Young. He also worked with the dancer James Waring. And I'm hoping people know who Lamont Young is. He's the sort of more or less founder of quote-unquote minimal music, drone music, et cetera, who in the late 50s and early 60s played this very important role. He was close to Anna Halprin and so forth, and then moved to New York City. And he edited this very important publication, An Anthology of Chance Operations. It was edited in 1961 and not published then until 1963, mostly because they ran out of money, that I'm working on a book on. And I consider An Anthology to be one of these just absolutely crucial documents of this emerging moment of interdisciplinarity. And it's an interdisciplinarity that is also very, in many respects, very international, though I can't make any kind of case for it being feminist, since I think the only two women involved were married to two of the men. You know, it was a different moment. So as you see from the program here, The program announces itself as the first in a series presented by Lamont Young. You can see there's a wide list of planned presenters that include a whole bunch of people that did not participate in the series: George Brecht, Walter de Maria, Yoko Ono, Christian Wolff, that somebody, I do not know who, has helpfully crossed off. You see the categories that include music, poetry, plays, machinery, and events, and then underneath that, the others by others to be arranged. So this is one of the, not the only, but one of the sort of opening moments of a certain very open, unbounded model of practice. You also see this sort of adamant declaration that the purpose of this series is not entertainment, and then underneath it, the idea that there won't be public events, that this is a sort of, you know, I won't say private, but more or less a sort of coterie project that is about a certain circle of people, certain overlapping circles of people. And I mean, I think it's a tremendously historically important moment. There's a few photos, but there's virtually no photos. There was absolutely no press reception at the time. I mean, it's the perfect event. And just to give you a couple more of the programs, I'm just going to go kind of quickly, but this is Toshio Shinagi, who is an interesting composer who, of course, was married to Yoko Ono at the time. He had studied with John Cage. This is for Jackson McCloe's program, and it's so Jackson McCloe that he's like overfilled the whole paper, like, you know, like he's probably jammed every single thing onto it, and it's sort of interesting to be aware that, you know, for him it's poetry, plays, as well as music, and that McCloe in particular really ties this circle into the living theater and to the edges of certain experimental theatrical practice. This is the program for Lamont Young's series of compositions, and I'll talk a tiny bit more about those in a second. This is the piece in which he draws a line across the stage 29 times that evidently took several hours. This is the program for Simone Forti's tremendously important and influential series of dance constructions. And then this last one that has got the worst quality is the quote-unquote An Environment by Robert Morris, in which he shows this piece, Passage. It is interesting that he uses the word environment there, because he sort of disavows it pretty much right after that, because I think he realizes that he does not want to be considered an environment artist. He wants to be a sculptor, and that is indeed far more functional in the 60s art world. So I've just given you a really tiny feel for that. And I want us to think about what is this context that this series, the Chamber Street series, emerged out of and contributed to. And one of the obvious things that needs to be noted that I feel like tends to get dropped out of, we have a discussion that tends to be about visual art, performance, film, etc. We forget that music was actually the framing context for most of this work. I mean, you could make a case that conceptual art, minimal art, process art, even site-based art comes out of music. I mean, it would be a bit of a stretch for a few of those, but there is an argument to be made, and it's a very specific trajectory of music, because it's a project of post-war experimental music, most closely associated with John Cage, but also, you know, any number of other people, Stockhausen, the Darmstadt Circle in Germany, various international practitioners. Among the qualities of this model of music is that it involves a very different sense of time. However different many people's projects were, it is precisely not the controlled, sequenced, linear type of time that had dominant Western classical music, you know, that sort of older narrative model of a sort of build-up, climax, denouement, etc. Instead, it is a new type of indeterminate, you know, a new type of much more open-ended experience of time, often generated by indeterminate procedures, chance procedures. In Cage's hands, it tends to have that quality of sort of any sounds in any order. With Lamont Young's work, it's much more often about this sort of very static, very slowed down type of time, but it's a fundamentally, well, it's arguably a fundamentally different experience of time, and it's a use of time or an experience of time that opens itself onto sculptural practices or site-based practices in a way that, you know, in the way that, say, conventional classic music just wouldn't. To think about where this comes from, I mean, where this kind of approach to music emerges and where this new experience of time emerges, I mean, one of the things that I think is really crucial is that it is partly about a relation to recorded sound and to the the impact of recording technologies on the arts, particularly in the post-war era, the intense impact of work with audio tape and electronic sound generation that, has a tremendous effect on people's experience of time. Though arguably you could go back a lot further to early cinema. I mean, I was just reading this great interview with the filmmaker Ken Jacobs where he talks about how as soon as you have film, time just dilates incredibly because suddenly you have, the time between two frames or, and it is partly working with film, with audio tape, et cetera, that your experience of time just is fundamentally different because you can, as Cage did in his early tape pieces, you can put 52 sounds in 1 second, which otherwise you wouldn't do. So there's this effect of recorded sound that, and the fact that there's, the availability of records, recordings, et cetera, that music, it becomes this thing that you mostly don't hear live, you consume via recordings, that has this paradoxical effect of pushing artists towards this other thing that is often about really extended durations of time, about work that is really adamantly experiential and bodily, that really focuses much more on sort of what you experience in the moment. So it's really not just about what you hear. And to give you an example of this, this is the piece by Lamont Young that he does at the Chambers Street series, and it's a sort of realization and change of this earlier, the piece that he had done before, the composition 1960, number 10, Draw a Straight Line and Follow It, in which at 2 concerts in ~61, one at Harvard, organized by some students, not organized by Harvard, the university, I'm sure, and then 2 months later at the Chambers Street series, he performs at Chambers Street with the collaboration of Bob Dunn. And I'll read you a short excerpt. This is in a letter that John Cage wrote to David Tudor. He describes the program as follows. We had a beautiful program by Lamont Young. He and Bob Dunn drew 30 straight lines using a string with a weight in the manner somewhat of surveying. By the time Lamont finished, not only had all the audience left, but Bob Dunn too had left, exhausted. The next evening, the project was shortened by shortening the line. Even then, it took 3 hours. The audience the evening I was there was small, but in excellent spirit. People conversed, read books, made collages, etc. One girl provided a kind of musical accompaniment unintended by Lamont. She kept pushing a large wooden spool with her foot until it fell over, then retrieved it, and the whole process began again. And to me, this piece where he's drawing a line across the stage 29 times is, to me, that's a foundational work of performance art that completely, it's part of this sort of emergence of task structures and the sort of strange physical, disciplined engagement with duration, with fatigue, with exhaustion, that, is obviously very tightly linked to things like some of Bruce Naumann's work. And just to sort of quickly point to Simone Forti's work that I hope people are familiar with, and this is this is how the scores were reproduced in an anthology, which is the sort of, that's the one, the program and the scores are like the one documents that we have, since Simone was not really in that self-archiving mode. And then this is a diagram she drew up quite a bit later. And as you can see, the pieces are distributed around the loft. They are not presented in a strictly timed way that you would do in a performance. They're, as she says, arranged much more like sculpture. She talks about it as people were walking around, all the pieces in the performance space were placed in different places. So it was placed more like sculpture in a gallery space, and the pieces were like that. And she really talks, say, with works like Huddle, this piece, of it being sort of a dance that's in a way a sculpture. And of course, it's a really interesting work because it's one in which, there's a framework that starts the piece, but the actual specifics of the duration, the movements, et cetera, are generated by the people who do it. Okay, and I'm assuming this work is reasonably familiar to people. So, let me shift my pages. What is going on with this work? Why is it compelling? And to me, it's really important to me historically, but it also offers, I think, some models that are not just historical, but that are actually still, I think, provocative and useful in the moment, in our own moment. As I mentioned, almost all of them occur over time in a relatively unstructured way. By doing so, they tend to allow viewers or even force viewers or listeners to create their own relation to the work. Because, you know, you're at this concert for 3 or 4 hours, you can focus on this or that, you can pay attention, you get tired, you can decide to walk around, you can decide to sit still. I mean, the piece itself, however different these pieces are, Young, Forte, and Robert Morris, they all force the viewer to sort of in some way construct their own relation to it. Another thing to be aware of is that all of these artists, I think, yeah, and I would include Morris in that too, we're all working with scores, and in particular scores that were often written scores that were textual scores, which is a very specific kind of score material. You know, because textual scores are both, they're vernacular, they can be read by anyone, they don't require musical training. They also tend to determine the work in a fairly loose or open-ended way. And I think that this model of the sort of score realization model, I mean, to me, it's like one of the sort of keys to 1960s art is, you know, you're transferring a model that in music is really normal and conventional into an area of practice in which it isn't. And so suddenly, you know, you have minimal artists who are doing a template and a realization, et cetera, et cetera. And this, to me, this model sort of underwrites a lot of 60s and synth production and offers some, you know, does some very interesting, you know, it fundamentally destabilizes the work of art in a lot of ways. And among the things to think about the score realization model is it introduces a set of qualities or a set of assumptions. One, that the work can be repeated, that it can be repeated by others, not necessarily by the artist. So it's not tied to the artist's body in the way that certain works of dance or certain works of performance art are, and that also the realization is potentially very open-ended. Of course, I always feel like this, I love Lawrence Weiner's work, and I feel like his work sort of crystallized those observations, but I feel like he's been sort of retrospectively given credit for a model that was in fact, you know, operative for arguably a good decade before he started to adopt it. Okay. So that's this historical model. Why are people interested in it now? What possibly are the stakes for that re-engagement? And I've got, what, like 5 minutes or so? Oh, okay, thanks. And I want to talk just really briefly about this piece. It's a work called Passage. It's an installation, quote unquote, in color and sound for 2 16mm projectors. And what it is 2 abstract colored light films that then are projected onto the same field so that they overlap and most of the time nearly cancel each other out so that there's sort of a sort of buzzing of color along the edges, and the color in the field does change, but it's, you know, if you have 2 light sources on top of each other, rather than having an additive relation, they have a subtractive relation. It hollows out. At the same time, there's a sound piece, the piece by Tashiwata, that's being played that is on the film, or that is on the, you know, the soundtrack of the film, so there's sort of 2 sound things going on at the same time as well, and I won't get into the details of it, but the 2 pieces have a sort of structural relationship that is both a formal structural relationship, and also the 2 makers, Tashiwata and Madison, have been collaborating for a long time. And Tashi also happens to be the son of Yoshiwata, who's this really interesting sort of composer and sound artist who's loosely affiliated with Fluxus, I suppose. And so this piece, the actual films themselves last about 13 minutes. They're played on looping projectors, so they go on and on and on. One happens to be a little bit longer than the other because the leader is a little bit longer, so that they gradually go ever so slightly out of sync. When they were developing the piece, Madison is someone who mostly makes films, but they had been working, trying to do something that in fact they could show in a gallery context that would involve that other sense of time that allows people to enter and leave at will, and, you know, where people can enter at any moment. When they did this 2 weeks ago, they did it for sort of over 5 hours, and quite a few people who went would stay for hours, which I realize that's sort of the few. I mean, this is, and it was also interesting because there's a whole circle of people in music and film who many of whom came out of CalArts the last several years, who I feel really lucky to be around because I feel like it's this moment where, I mean, I moved back to LA in 2007, and there's been this sort of really active world of experimental music and experimental arts that's been very dynamic that I've had the luck to be involved with, so that these things that I teach, like Lamont Young or John Cage and so forth, that we often think of as historical materials, are in this context very much alive and still very generative. And And I find it very interesting that these people, many of whom are a good almost 20 years younger than I am, have this intense involvement and engagement with these historical trajectories. And it's partly about, you know, all those people who are 28 who all own record players. You know, that it's partly about the sort of fascination with the analog, but really, you know, not just in a sort of fetishized or cliched way, but about the pursuit of certain kinds of perceptual experiences and about the sort of richness, I guess I should show you that again, of a certain kind of durational perceptual experience and the sort of deep possibilities that that involves. I mean, clearly one part of why this is an interesting set of practices, I mean, partly it's about a challenge to the present, right? I mean, one thing that is at play is that this is, I don't want to say a refusal because I don't think that's what motivates it, but it's about as far as you could get from a market-based economy. It's also about a kind of work that is really not going to easily get picked up by any kind of institutional culture. And this, you know, particularly takes place in LA where we have this really dynamic art world. We have a really rich, at the moment, series of sort of artist-run and self-organized spaces, while at the same time we have this, frankly, quite dysfunctional gallery context, and also, you know, for the most case, a quite dysfunctional institutional context. I mean, you know, and of course it's very difficult because in the U.S., I mean, the funding structures of U.S. museums more or less require them to be dysfunctional. You know, I mean, it's a structural issue. It's not a personal issue. But obviously, I think this work is about more than just a kind of refusal. It's about a challenge to viewers. It's a much more demanding kind of experience. But it also, I at least find, I love this work. And I've always, I mean, I'm a child of television. I grew up watching 6 or 7 hours of TV a day. And I've always, and TV was slower then, by the way. But you know, when I first found Michael Snow films, I found them beautiful and breathtaking. And there was something about that intensity and that kind of experience that I think, you know, part of what that sort of durationality offers is, you know, this fundamentally different kind of experience than those offered by our sort of ever-increasing, you know, mass cultural apparatus. So let's end there. Thank you. And that's just Tashi performing a piece of this at this weird MoCA thing that was a family day. So it's on 2 turntables, yeah. Anyhow.
Okay, thanks for staying with us. Really amazing how good you are in performing with us. Yeah, interestingly enough, this last panel brings us back to the institutions. I like that. To its skills, to its resources, and reviewing it, what it can do. I thought, since the title of the panel, and no one really felt it needs an explanation, is called Curators De-Skilling, Critics Rethinking. I thought we should have a look at what reskilling, and that's what here, Freud is back. I thought I'll do the opposite. Let's look at de-skilling, the notion of de-skilling, because that's what I'm more familiar with, actually. Sorry to say, what a surprise. Okay, so actually we know it, and I had to look it up thanks to Google, because I'm more involved how it's used in the arts. So it's actually, of course, a Marxist theory as it entered our theory cloud. In the 70s, looking how labor or work has been increasingly turned into, as it's called, proletarization of our workforce, turning work increasingly into a commodity. Interesting how this relates to performance and the institution. And I got introduced to it, of course, to Benjamin Buchloh, who used this term or introduced this term into the practice of conceptual art as he was reviewing it, speaking about artists eliminating the artisanal, as he likes to call it, artisanal competencies and aesthetics. And there has been a lot of discourse about it and even responses by artists through the work. And then it brought me back to something I was looking into it more recently, to the writing of Jacques Rancière, who writes about immaterial labor without an end product in his Politics of Aesthetics. and that labor turned into something which is more involved, what we call, I hope I get it right in English, virtuosic. Is this existing? Yes, sorry about that. Okay, virtuosic. So a work which has no end product, actually. So it takes the example, of course, of the pianist, the violin player who performs, we could say restages, something very common in music and other fields, a piece. And so it's really about that, but there's no real end product. And how our work is so much about, and now I bring sort of the executive version, about communication and how we are performing our virtuosity, that this became imperative to us in general. So thinking about that, this raises the question of the skills of an institution, if we take the institution as a persona, which it is in legal terms. And I thought there has been so much talk about MoMA, and I constantly saw the atrium. It was kind of, the atrium. Some artists feel like that, oh my God, you want to show me the atrium to do something. So then we have a site and say, but there's a small space there, you can also do something. However, so I thought how an institution and this, how MoMA, what kind of skills an institution can bring it to stage life art at the museum, because I agree it was always there, but it was always there as the other, as the add-on. It was never the priority program of the museum. Often it was a parallel event, like I used to ask by colleagues, I'm doing a show on this and that, I want to do some dance in parallel. I said, great. I do something on this and that, I want to do some performance, I want to do some music. And so it becomes a side dish, which I don't like, actually, because I think it deserves its own rights, its own topic, its own exhibition, even it's not a material exhibition space. So just talking a little bit backstage about MoMA, what it means, and Ralph can sing his own song about that, I guess, with me in choir. What it means, especially to organize dance at the Museum of Modern Art, you might be interested to know about that. First, we don't have something what is called a green room, where the performers can spend time, can get food, can stretch, relax in between. We have really hard problems finding space for rehearsal beyond the regular museum hours. MoMA is a unionized museum. I guess you know about that, at least through the arts. So it's really raising a lot of questions. We have a lot of issues with visa and, again, unions of performers. We have to get a working visa for performance, which we don't need for visual artists, interestingly. And we found out if a performer is doing a lecture at the site, we might not need a visa. So we're turning them into scholars, actually. This will have a big impact, I guess, in the future. The whole structure of the museum, as I mentioned in my talk, is very different and really not at all fit for dance, especially. We have to deal with radically different fee structures. Performative artists performing for performative arts have clear fee structures, while in the visual arts it's still not usual that an artist gets a fee paid. The atrium, which, since we saw it so often, it seems to be really the place, is, you could say, obviously the only popular stage we can provide, but as a matter of fact, it's a battlefield. It's a battlefield of the Museum of Modern Art, not only among us colleagues, but also among making money out of the museum. This is our high rental space. And when I see these amazing multimedia events that Google or all these companies rent our space, when I go home in the atrium, I think, my God, I would like to have this budget to do this. It's really amazing sometimes. And I have to read my notes. Yeah, and this is actually really interesting. That's a call to you, because you are our audience. If a work is actually not staged in this A space, it doesn't get a lot of attention. So this kind of providing this critical mass of a space, the atrium, makes a work important. If it's done somewhere, discreetly, can be more and more interesting. It doesn't get the attention from the audience and from the press. And then this is another thing I wanted to share with you is, of course, that the sequence of staging of events in the atrium especially has an influence on the reception. And this does worry me a lot because I often can't influence it. I have to navigate within the opportunities, within these windows in the atrium, literary, and sometimes I feel events are too close, or so one bothers the other, or one overshadows one which is more radical, and the one is probably more popular due to its nature, so it's actually not neutral, like a gallery. You have a sequence of exhibitions, and of course you have more or less popular exhibitions, but these live events, they have their own, I don't know, I'm still studying it, I don't know. And yeah, and again, what we saw today, especially today, talking about dance, these presence of photographs of MoMA's atrium, and they talk about it's great that MoMA is doing dance and all this. That reaffirms my theory, actually, about dance, to remind in the beginning that it brings back skills and beauty, yeah, in some way or the other, if we want it or not. So this relates to all your great talks. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed. And I would like to start really in the order of speaking. Darcy, you said, and this is about skills. I'm also a manager. I like that. And involves, as you said, many things with no explicit training in many areas. So this totally ties to this idea of de-skilling, actually, in all the three sense, actually. I thought that's really interesting, how you addressed your task and your role, and I'm just doing you all together. And what I also find interesting in the walk, I just had the chance to visit it for the first time. I knew about when the building was planned by Kathy Horbrich at that time, and all this Herzog Demeron thing, because they did a lot of buildings at that time in Europe. I wonder how the building performs, which I understood is considered as a city within a skin of a building. So the individual galleries are conceived as an urban agglomerate of individual entities. How this performs, or how your projects are able to be performed within this stage set, I would even call it. So the importance of the building, of the architecture we use, and this brings me back to this idea of Lefebvre, this notion of decay. And I think if we look at how museum architecture has developed from this sort of Renaissance building, and here you have this, Acropolis idea at Berkeley also a lot, these kind of horizontal architecture, and then it becomes this opening up of something, wow, completely explosive and exciting and performative, how museum architecture is done today. I think this tells a lot of the relationship of art and the institution. And then, Ferran, what you said, this kind of idea of an expanded exhibition, and so you expanded, but at the same time the artists are pushing constantly the rubber ball of the institution, the setting of the institution, and it's kind of a sort of oppositional play going on. So the word curare means, of course, taking care, which I always found so strange, actually, taking care of art and the artists, and at the same time the artist does the opposite, tries really to go systematically over boundaries. Not all the artists are doing it, but I mean, in a way, it's also strange we like to do that. Don't you dream about the easy project once you want to do? Really, smooth plan A, done. So this kind of nature that seems to be, I don't know. And Liz, I liked very much how you, and I think because this was totally missing the role of the artist space. The artist space as a container, as an autonomous site where incredible things could happen, which were really pioneering what MoMA tries now, I don't know, 30 years later, maybe, and we probably won't succeed in that way, how Yoko was able, and if you talk to Yoko, she always said she just provided the space, and typed these little programs or whatever, but these kind of generous, really very generous gesture, also not interfering, enabling, making it possible, which is another idea of curare, by the way, the role of the curator, not competing with the artist, but providing, making it possible, and this role of intermediate work of art. And how it changed through the impact of technology. It's strange, time is represented through a clock. We didn't talk a lot about technology, actually, and this is, of course, the trigger for all of this. And yeah, and the de-skilling, sorry, of using scores in all kinds of way, and how this imposes also something to the performer, but also to the audience, of course, because dealing with the score is also an imaginative work of art, I think, what makes it so great. So that's what I have to say, and I'd like to hear from you. All of you.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I guess I actually wanted to sort of, to some extent, shift off the question of the institution because, well, it just happens to not be my job, whereas I guess you guys, it is your job. But, I mean, I do want to more foreground, what are things going on in the work and what are certain tendencies or trajectories that are happening in work. I'm very grateful that there are spaces, that there are artist-run spaces and so forth that make this available, and that it does come out of that kind of necessity. I mean, I was, of course, secretly laughing when Danny Martinez was talking about how artist spaces last too long because LA, this is just so true, unfortunately. I mean, I wish I didn't feel that way, but I'm like, has lace been functional in my lifetime? I mean, and it's because it's difficult, because what it takes, in fact, to run an artist space is not something that's possible for anyone to sustain. It takes a certain kind of lifestyle and willingness to sacrifice and commitment that most people only have when they're young, and I certainly would not have that at this point in my life. But I also love that because, I tend to more believe in the art that people do when no one is paying them for it, because I'm aware of even, say, the writing that I do for money and the catalog gigs I've done mostly because someone's paying, and those are usually not my best pieces, though I do very much appreciate the funds. I mean, I realize I cling to what may be just this absolutely old-fashioned notion of art as, something done mostly for love. Mm-hmm. And, I live in a world that most of my friends have been very successful about making work that cannot be collected or shown.
Well, I think that, I work for an institution, but I try not to think about the institution too hard. Because an institution is its people, and our people are the artists. And actually, I mean, it's interesting that you say that you find that artists are still really wanting that, that the big hall, the atrium at MoMA, because what we're finding is actually more and more artists are seeking to work outside of the big halls, and that we have to come up with a completely different marketing strategy, because a lot of them are sort of guerrilla action, in hallways and in corridors and in elevators and a lot of the marketing, when you said, you kind of made reference to the fact that these don't get attention necessarily, these more sort of nimble, smaller scale actions that are staged, anywhere around the institution and beyond. I mean, there are all of these, these social media, outlets now that artists are using to really get word out about what they're doing, and there's not this reliance, I find, on traditional marketing systems either. So, for us at the Walker, and I'm sure I have colleagues that are thinking along the same lines elsewhere, I mean, we have our traditional outlets for some of the larger scale things, but then artists are often the best PR machines for their own works, and when they do these smaller scale projects, which really actually infect, and I use that word in a really positive way, infect our walls and our halls and in a wonderful manner. They're kind of working their own system that's outside of ours, and that's,
So that was actually a misunderstanding. What I was referring to is that the audience actually is paying more attention to projects which are large scale and in a prominent space. But how would you, before we go to Ferran to find his easy project, how would you reskill your tools facing this kind of the change of, let's say, the museum vocabulary of exhibitions and activities? What do you think, what kind of reskilling does it require for you as a chief curator?
I think that, I don't know, I mean, I still value this idea that I hold a certain degree of expertise in certain fields, you know, and that I have a depth of knowledge in certain things. You know, the reskilling is basically like creating more context for curators to learn from each other. And also to learn from artists. So we're structuring different, I mean, I have a very pragmatic answer to that question, which is that we now have within our meeting structure and how we engage one another institutionally and beyond, different sort of meetings and forums that are used to surface certain topics that we all seem to be talking about in different ways across our disciplines. And sometimes we'll bring artists in to facilitate and moderate those discussions, and other times they'll be more closed. So I think basically a very simple answer is just, you know, really structuring and directing communications. The people are learning from each other. And that means we're pulling people out of their silos, in effect, and making them kind of, you know, not making them. I mean, it's a very congenial atmosphere and people are constantly exchanging ideas. But I mean, sometimes you have to be quite structured about that. So that's one tact for sort of more, I wouldn't say de-skilling or reskilling. It's more just about sharing knowledge.
The question, if we talk about reskilling, would be what are the original skills of a curator?
Right.
Means inventorizing or dustbinning objects, or so how would you reskill? You would further expand the notion of time in exhibitions, or what would your...
Okay, if I think about the institutionalization of art, I think art acts like icebergs. I mean, you only... Art like icebergs.
Icebergs, like the one outside.
No, icebergs.
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 Okay.
That you only see 1/10, and then 9 parts are below the water level, and that's true and it's beautiful. But you only see that what it's visible. So I think that institutions work in that sense, and it's true that I mean the institutionalization of art. It's part of art itself, and I think that we can. I mean, it's very beautiful saying that we are that we can think beyond that, but then probably the rest of the world will think in terms of institution.
And you're part of it. How can you think beyond?
Yeah. And that's why I think that institutional critique has made so much sense in the last 30 years, because it has brought the main issues of how especially symbolic and economic power circulates around the art world.
So if the curator, I mean, we have Jens here with his practice using sort of literature as a point of departure, trigger for his exhibition. So if you take the practice of an institutional artist and map it on your practice as a curator, as an institutional critical curator, which makes you in fact compete with Netkov, what do you do next?
I mean, I didn't want to. I mean, I think
know,
that,
but
well, I don't have a clear answer. It's also true that when you say that it would be great to have always a plan, at least once.
Once a year.
Once a year, what happens if the plan A, it works? But usually it doesn't for some reason. I think, I mean, for me it's not easy working in that project with Netco, also because it made visible in a very funny way, very poetic and way. But it was not easy also, I mean, to just to play a role in the artist project, and that has happened sometimes in the last years for me, that I have been involved unexpectedly in the project of the artist. And I have to say, I agreed. I could have said no, but I think that's one of the skills that at least I could give as a curator is okay, when it's needed, okay, just do that. I mean, I don't like my image on a video, but it's fine.
So I would like to ask you, before we open to the floor, maybe I think what I feel sometimes is constant desire for innovation and change of an institution in order to compete, actually, with the contemporary modern art museum has to be modern and not like what Gertrude Stein is inherently, can't be contemporary. Does this provoke this? Do we make our life difficult by ourselves?
Maybe we should open up to the audience.
Yeah.
I was going to
Or
suggest
is this part of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there are questions, there's a microphone here. Did anybody would like to? Andrew?
So I had just sort of an open thought about de-skilling, just to continue that conversation. And that's that and maybe this is taking up on Liz's talk, but that it's really important to think about de-skilling in relation to technological change. There hasn't been a lot of discussion of new media at the conference, or at least the parts that I've been able to see. And yet we keep, stubbing our proverbial toes on PowerPoints that don't work. And I think everyone's experienced with the phenomenon of going to see a show and the projections aren't working. And no one who actually works in the gallery is able to make them work because the guy who, the preparator who knows how to actually, connect the cables isn't there that day or whatever. So it strikes me that, artists might be de-skilling themselves, but we're always sort of being de-skilled forcibly by technology and maybe, by this rate of technological change. That's just sort of an open thought if it's of interest to anyone. But I had a question more specifically for Ferran, and it had to do with other ways of thinking expanded events as an exhibition format. I was thinking about two recent projects, one being Thomas Hirschhorn's Bilmer Spinoza Festival in Amsterdam from several years ago, and the other being this ongoing project that Tanya Bruguera is doing through Creative Time in New York. I think it's called the Immigrant Movement International. And both of these are sort of extended durational projects, but ones that take place outside the galleries of a museum, often with some sort of independent funding, and ones that I think we would agree are critical of institutions, but probably not primarily of the art institution. They're interested in imbalances of knowledge with the case of the Hirschhorn, or the politics of migration with Bruguera. So maybe my question to you would be, what are ways in which we might think expanded events as they sort of go across the borders of the institution? What sort of challenges do those pose?
Well, in any case, if I think that institutional critique is interesting, it's not because it poses questions only to the institution of art, because the institution of art is only mimetic of the world itself. I mean, when I don't know if you've found somebody saying that the art world is unfair. Well, it's unfair because the world is unfair. I mean, the revolution will not start in the art world, probably. So for me, the answer is that I think that when some issues are raised in the museum, and when the curator is fighting against the artist or staging a fight, I think it can be understood as everything in art, metaphorically, of other kind of fights, of who is in charge of the power. So that's why I think. Then of course, if you do the next step and then you go directly but that the thing is, it's another thing. It's not institutional critique. That is a bit more of direct action that I also appreciate.
Nora.
One of the, in your presentations, what I was sort of struck by, that seemed that all three of you, when you spoke about either, in your case, Ferran, when you spoke about the competition with the artist, and Darcy, you mentioned, you emphasized the importance of working with people, and we've heard about communication, and Liz, you also spoke about just how fortunate you are to be in a certain environment right now, working with young people. But I was also struck that in your presentation, when you showed the record or the invitation and said, well, this is not open to the public, you know, you can provide names to be on the mailing list, right? So it's already a closed event. And in a lot of the slides that we've seen about performances, the performances at MoMA and others throughout this conference, you know, if you're looking at the audience, some of us are recognizing art stars in the audience. You know, you can see recognizable figures, which again begs the question, well, how open are these performances when they're taking place in institutions? And this gets back to an issue that Jeffrey raised, I think, on the first day, is that who's the public, basically? And what happens when there is this move into a museum off of sort of like more public spaces? And Liz, I think you kind of reminded us of these like public communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to be in a museum now because you have to program for such a wide public. And I mean, I have real questions about how viable it is to present performance in American museums, but I mean, it's hard to even present paintings in American museums. I mean, you know, you go to MoMA and it's like being in an airport. There's the strollers, and I mean, it's a very difficult environment in which to see art. And I have to say, I always really appreciated the Walker when I lived in Minneapolis, because not only do they have an extraordinary collection, but I mean, I know for you it's not a positive thing, but it's the galleries are not crowded. And you can actually see work and experience work in a way that is very hard to do. You know, I mean, I realize for museums that's not supposed to be a good thing, but I mean, you know, I mean, I really cherish that somewhat more intimate type of relationship, and it's very hard to have it in certain situations. I mean, I think for a more generative stage of art making with people who may be young or maybe not young at all, I mean, I think that the audience is often a much smaller sort of friends and participants type of audience, and I think that's a perfectly valuable function. I mean, I don't see that there's any, to me, there's not necessarily a problem that something is not going to get a wide audience. You know, I realize that you know, I mean, I would like to think that certain kind of work is potentially open for other people, but I mean, realistically, you know, it's not going to get the attention that Michael Heiser's Rock is getting, and that's okay, you know.
Other questions? Yeah, I can't see who you are, but in the back, yeah. Is that Jonah?
I was very fascinated by the acquisition of the Cunningham archive when it occurred, particularly because it's quite diagonal. For example, to the acquisition of the Cage archive, which was by Bard College, or sort of housed within Bard College and integrated into the curriculum. So I was wondering if we could attend to that massive acquisition in terms of its reskilling and deskilling, because I think it's could have such generative impact. And I'm sorry for the sweat stains on the costume.
Well, I'll just respond. I mean, it's already reskilling us, I guess, just by my acquisition of some knowledge now of that particular moment in dance history, and we're bringing people in who are helping us to understand the relationship between dance and the visual art. And it's nice because it is a truly kind of interdisciplinary effort where we're, you know, drawing upon scholars who have a background in, you know, Black Mountain, in dance, and the actual scale of the collection itself, which is just enormous, is forcing us to slow down our expectations of how quickly we can learn this history and understand the best way to present it. So we actually have quite a long horizon on this, and see it as a commitment that's going to take us probably a number of years to really fully understand and tend to. So yeah, we're starting, what we knew at the time would be a complete reimagination of how and what we collect and the skills that we need to create scholarship and knowledge around that collection.
Michelle.
Thank you. one of the things that's been so delightful about listening to all these our speakers has been being reminded of so many different histories and so many different practices. And I'm definitely beginning to understand why some of the posts on our blog question the use of the phrase time-based art, because I think at the end of 3 days there's not much left that we haven't included in that category. But Ferran, I really enjoyed your expansion of the term to think of time in another way that didn't involve performance or video or dance. And it reminded me of one more practice that I thought we could add to our list that has come up in a number of our symposia earlier this year, but not at this one, which has been called food-based practices. And in earlier context, it was more as a sort of extension of social practice and serving meals and the sort of the spirit of generosity and inclusion. But in the pieces that you were showing us, it reminded me of some work by William Pope L. that really took the form more of a sculpture or an installation made of food, which rotted. So I just thought I would put that out as one more model of time in the gallery of a work that's going to disintegrate.
Yeah. And in the, when I was talking about Wilfredo Prieto, this Cuban artist, he also uses sometimes this kind of ephemeral material. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. His work is very interesting. It acts in a level that is quite linked to this. Is the Latin American post-minimalism. And I don't know if you are familiar with the use of post-minimalism in Latin America. Latin America basically, especially Brazil and Cuba, have had a very strong use of the minimalist vocabulary to reshape their own history. It's very interesting. For example, he works with very simple materials and very simple changes of idea from the title, generally in his case, title, material, and what you actually see is the same. So, for example, this holy water pond was exactly that, a pond of holy water. It was not easy to find a priest, by the way, about problems that would want to understand what contemporary art is, but finally, our mistake was trying to find a progressive priest. The conservative was much easier. Yeah, because he understood that where religion was needed, he was there, and it was perfect. I mean, he didn't care about the art. But linked to what you're saying, what was very beautiful is this idea of holy water as the first ready-made in history. Because water, after becomes holy, is exactly the same water. When the Catholic,
Sure.
Yeah. In fact, there are some sects of Christianism that they add some kind of salts or something just to make it a bit different. But for Catholicism, that obviously is the major religion in Spain, it's exactly the same before and after. In fact, since we needed so many gallons of water, we just opened the trunk of the van that brought the water. He said he made the performance. He made the performance, and he suddenly and in fact again, I didn't understand the work until I saw the performance of the priest becoming just a normal water into holy water. That was exactly what Duchamp did in the tents.
With the holy water, I think we should bring this to a close. Thank you to all our panelists.